Good morning to everyone in the audience today. It is my absolute delight and great pleasure to welcome everyone to the 2022 Balsillie Lecture. The annual Balsillie Lecture hosts distinguished scholars and writers whose work influences thinking on critical challenges to humanity. The speaker is an outstanding international personality who, in significant and innovative ways, contributes to a more just, peaceful, and environmentally sustainable world through valuable achievements in politics or research. Before I turn the floor over to Mr. Jim Balsillie, founder of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, to officially launch the event and to introduce today's distinguished guest, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. One of the actions we take at the Balsillie School to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. We are proud to acknowledge that the Balsillie School is situated on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge the land upon which we are situated in all we do, including this very important annual Balsillie Lecture. It is now my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome Mr. Jim Balsillie, Canadian businessman, philanthropist, and generous founder of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Jim, we are delighted to have you with us here today to open this important event and to introduce our eminent Balsillie lecturer. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's a pleasure to be with you, and to everyone, welcome to the 2022 Balsillie Lecture. As one of Canada's leading centers for the study and teaching of international affairs and global governance, the BSIA seeks answers and resolutions to the crises and problems affecting humanity across the globe today. I'm pleased to see the school playing such an active and constructive role in informing relevant debates. Yet in order to face the unpredictability and uncertainty of these strange times, we must first look to the future by first undertaking critical, careful, and thoughtful analyses of the past. Only by gaining insight into where we have gone together and who we once were, can we gain a sense of who we are today and our shared potential for the future. I'm delighted that the school is hosting another annual Balsillie Lecture, a platform for Canada's and the world's leading thinkers to offer lessons and insights into the complex dynamics that comprise our local, national, and global worlds. I'm pleased to officially open the 2022 lecture, being delivered by one of the world's most noted and celebrated scholars of international affairs. It's an honor to welcome Professor Amitav Acharya, the UNESCO Chair of Transnational Challenges and Governance and Distinguished Professor at the School of International Service, American University in Washington, D.C. Professor Acharya is the first non-Western scholar to be elected as President of the International Studies Association, the largest and most influential global network of international studies. Previously, he was professor at York University in Toronto and Bristol University in the UK. He is currently an honorary professor at Rhodes University in South Africa and guest professor at Nankai University in China. He was the inaugural Boeing Company Chair of IR at the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, fellow at Harvard's Asia Center and JFK School of Government, and Christensen Fellow at Oxford. His books include Reimagining International Relations, World Orders in the Thought and Practice of Indian, Chinese, and Islamic Civilizations in 2022, The Making of Global International Relations in 2019, Constructing Global Order in 2018, The End of American World Order in 2018, Why Govern? Rethinking Demand and Progress in Global Governance in 2016, The Making of Southeast Asia in 2013, Whose Ideas Matter in 2009, and Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia in 2001. His essays have appeared in publications such as International Organization, International Security, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Asian Studies, Foreign Affairs, Journal of Peace Research, International Affairs, Perspectives on Politics, and World Politics. As many of you know, Professor Acharya frequently appears in the media, providing well-informed insight and expertise. He's written op-eds for Financial Times, the International Herald Tribune, Washington Post, Times of India, Australian Financial Review, and other newspapers around the world. He has also appeared on news media such as CNN International, BBC TV, and BBC World Service Radio. He is the recipient of 2 Distinguished Scholar Awards from the ISA, and in 2020, he received the American University's highest honor, Scholar Teacher of the Year Award. It's a pleasure to host you at the BSIA today at this very special annual event, a tradition that I and the school hope will continue for many years to come. There's no better way to celebrate our resilience in these odd times and to articulate our hopes and possibilities for the future than by turning the floor over to someone as so skilled at analyzing how our past shapes lessons, knowledge, and hopes for the future generations to come. Amitav, I welcome you to the BSIA. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Founder Jim Balsillie. Thank you, Director Ann Fitzgerald. Thank you, the BSIA community, for this honor of letting me give you a 2022 Balsillie lecture. Since time is short, I will go straight to the topic and cover the topic, as you know, is multipolarity or multiplex, and how the changing world order is affecting the West, the rest, and the rising powers. Of course, there's plenty to talk about. The last few days, few weeks have been really a moment of profound change in world order. I will cover that towards the end of my presentation today. But in the beginning, I will start with a little more conceptual take on what is world order, or what is the debate about the future of world order. The term, let's start with the term multipolarity. It's very much the buzzword for policymakers and academics as well when they describe the changing world order, meaning the end of the Cold War to the unipolar moment under US dominance to what's happening now. So just to give an example, many of you know on the 4th of February, Russia's Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping signed a very historic, very important declaration. And they used in the declaration multipolarity 4 times, not once, twice, 4 times. And even more important, they used the term in both as a condition and as an aspiration, meaning that multipolarity is already happening if you look at the trends in the world, but it's also something, multipolarity is something they want to push for, aspire for. So just to give you a flavor of what they said, today the world sees the development of such processes and phenomena as multipolarity, globalization, the advent of information society, and so on and so forth. In the same declaration, they also say that the 2 sides, China and Russia, will seek genuine multipolarity and try to advance multipolarity. So seek, advance multipolarity. So it's both a condition that they see already happening along with globalization and information society, but also something they want to contribute to and realize even to a fuller extent. But they are not alone. The BRICS, the group of rising powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they also are into multipolarity. So the last BRIC summit in New Delhi, in India, September 2021, the declaration included this phrase: we pledge to promote a more inclusive, equitable, and representative multipolar international system. And this has been a refrain of many BRICS declarations for the past several years. In fact, they were the same in Moscow the year before, same in, I guess, South Africa the year before. So it is not just China and Russia, but India, Brazil, South Africa have bought into this as well. For rising powers, this term is very attractive because it is kind of it's a feel-good term, because they're getting into the great power club. Of course, China has already done that. Russia was already kind of an old-fashioned great power. But for India, Brazil, South Africa, being part of a multipolar system means they are part of it. So they are also the leaders. So it's kind of a feel-good aspirational term. But what about the traditional, more traditional powers like France or United States. France is always for multipolarity because it often feels sidelined in the superpower discourse, like during the Cold War, US, Soviet Union, now US, China, and Russia. So when the French feel sidelined, they bring in multipolarity because they are one of the poles, and they are always been a pole in their view, at least since the rise of the modern European state system. What about the United States? This is a country that has most to lose if we have multipolarity, because the United States loves hegemony, unipolarity. But even some policymakers in the United States have accepted that a multipolar world is emerging. So to quote William Burns, who was Obama's Undersecretary of State and currently the CIA director. So he said, before he became the CIA director, but when he was the Undersecretary of State, he said that the world is becoming increasingly multipolar and profoundly interdependent. Now, this is very important because having multipolarity and interdependence at the same time is a very important combination of two forces, and I'll come back to this later. So it is the buzzword. So why do I disagree with it? Why do you want to replace this word with something that I call multiplex? Well, I have three reasons for it. But before I go into this, let me just tell you what we mean by multipolarity in the sort of definition of the term. Well, American political scientist Barry Pogen from MIT recently defined multipolarity as a relatively equal distribution of capabilities with three or more consequential actors. So I'd like to focus on consequential actors, because who is consequential, who is not, is a matter of great debate, at least for me. That's Barry Pogen from MIT. A French political scientist, no surprises there, French love multipolarity, defines Jacques Leidy. He defines multipolarity as a system in which power is distributed at least among three significant poles, concentrating wealth and or military capabilities, in which each of these poles is capable of producing order or generating disorder to influence global outcomes beyond its own borders. A bit of a mouthful, but the key terms here are three or more poles. And poles are a little more significant than powers. So if you're a pole, you are really very more significant than even just a power, okay? And concentrating wealth and military capabilities. So there's a concentration of military and economic capabilities, meaning it is material power, distribution of material power. There's no reference here to ideas, in which each of these poles can affect global outcomes, not just regional, but global outcomes, both whether in generating order or whether generating disorder on a global scale to influence global outcomes. So these are powers of global significance, not just regional. They do that with military and economic capability, mainly through them, and they can generate order as well as disorder. So this is kind of a definition of multipolarity we have in the academic literature. And the policy literature comes close to it, but there are different nuances. Now, why do I want to challenge it? First, it's too narrow. It talks about distribution of material capabilities, concentrating wealth and military power. What about ideas? What about ideology? What about culture? So for me, world order is not just about distribution of material power. It's also about distribution of ideas and culture. So those things matter, and we don't need convincing anymore in the 21st century that ideas matter. Those who focus on distribution of military and economic capabilities take a very narrow view. And in fact, there's a lot of scholarship that says material power or polarity by itself is not enough. It doesn't matter. We need a lot more than just polarity in the material sense. We need ideas. We need other variables like institutions of governance, for example, global governance as well, which doesn't necessarily always reflect the distribution of power. So that's the first one. This definition is too narrow. Second, why I reject multipolarity, it has a baggage. It is very Eurocentric. the term multipolarity really came straight out of the European geopolitical playbook of the 19th century and early 20th century. So world before 20th century was multipolar. World before the Second World War was multipolar. We all know that Britain and France and Russia and Russia or unified Germany, Austria-Hungary, and United States got in late. And honestly, some people think Japan was part of it, but Japan never got the equal treatment. Japan's demand for racial equality was rejected by Woodrow Wilson at the Versailles Conference. So it has a baggage. It's a very Eurocentric term. And another baggage is that multipolarity is often associated with instability. So those of you who do international relations would know the very famous article by Kenneth Wall, who passed away just a few years ago, that bipolar systems are more stable than multipolar systems. So the stability of the bipolar world, his very famous article, which many people still read in our PhD core courses. So his argument is that multipolar systems are inherently unstable because there are too many actors, very confusing. You don't know who is your ally, who is your friend, whereas a bipolar system is more stable. So he was comparing bipolarity and multipolarity. More recently, scholars like John Mearsheimer has taken up that and argues that multipolarity is also unstable. It's happening, but it's unstable. So if we have that kind of a baggage, and we always go back to look at what happened in Europe, by the way, 19th century, early 20th century, 2 world wars, but all kinds of other wars. And under a multipolar system, we get scared. So if we bring in multipolarity to the picture, to a discourse, we are almost predisposed to think of the future as dark, chaotic, and unstable. War is breaking out. In fact, many other academics have used multipolarity to describe the future of Asia. There's a very famous article by Aaron Friedberg from Princeton University called Ripe for Rivalry, Prospects for Peace in Multipolar Asia. So Asia is becoming multipolar, it's ripe for rivalry. He also said that Asia's future would be Europe's past. Europe's past, meaning multipolar instability, would become Asia's future. So that baggage definitely predisposes us to think of a multipolar world as very unstable. There are some scholars who have argued that multipolarity actually need not be unstable. It can create stability. There are some mechanisms in multipolarity that can create stability, but these are few and far between. Most of the scholarship gives multipolarity sort of an association with instability. Then that's the second reason. I don't want to use a term that has a baggage. None of us should use terms that has a baggage that predisposes us to think about the future in terms of something that happened in the past, and that too in Europe. In East Asia, by the way, where the East Asian system was much more hierarchical rather than multipolar, it was quite different. East Asia did not have a multipolar system the time of Chinese dominance before the advent of European colonial powers. So if we want to talk of history, why talk about European history? Why don't talk about Asian history? That's an argument. The third reason why I reject multipolarity is that we do need new terms. We need a new vocabulary of international relations for a new reality, new world order that's unfolding before us. Because in a multipolar world the historical ideal type, we didn't have a lot of things that are happening today. Things are happening in the last 25 years in terms of norms, institutions, and also ideas in world order. Even things like interdependence. They're all changing. The nature and scope of global governance is changing. As we speak, it's no longer dominated by state actors. Non-state actors have got in. So to describe a new world, to understand a new world, we need a new vocabulary rather than be beholden to some words, some concepts that have a certain baggage. And that has been very important to my scholarship on world order. So I bring in a term called multiplexity. For the lack of a better word, no word is perfect, but I think this term explains the changing world order much better. So this term basically differs from multipolarity. It talks about distribution of not just power, but also ideas. It talks about actors that are not just states or great powers. The multipolar system was great power centric. All the consequential actors are great powers. A multiplex system is it has all kinds of powers, regional powers, non-state actors, institutions, corporations, private actors, and the like. And they are consequential as far as I'm concerned. And that's the way I read the changing world order. He also talks about the global power shift, and I'll come to that. Global power shift, not just the West, Western dominance declining to a more sort of, if not level playing field, at least non-Western powers are rising, and including especially China and to lesser extent India. So Multiplex takes into account non-Western powers, their contribution and role. And also Multiplex talks about the broader nature of interdependence. Interdependence today is very different from interdependence. I'm talking about economic interdependence, but also interdependence that is generated by transnational forces, like climate change, for example. That wasn't really, there were not awareness of that back in the 19th century to that extent that we have today. So Multiplex captures the changing nature of interdependence and the higher density and variety of international institutions that simply did not exist in the 19th or early 20th century. And also Multiplexity talks about not a single way, the Western liberal way of achieving modernity, meaning economic progress and peace, but also multiple modernities, multiple pathways for achieving basically the same goal. So it is a broader term. It really gets away from the baggage of multipolarity, and I think it explains the world we live in today much more better, not perfectly, much better. So having said that, I would like to talk about this term in comparison to the two other terms that people use a lot. And what multipolarity, I already give you some sense, but there is also this term called liberal hegemony or the liberal international order. So when people talk about world order today, they have in mind multipolarity, they have in mind still liberal international order, although people agree, many people believe it's a bit of a passe by its use by date, past its use by date, but it's still there. And some people hope to bring it back, like the Biden administration to some extent. So multipolarity, liberal international order, or some people call it liberal hegemony because it was under US hegemony, and multiplex. Let's compare this, and then I will end my lecture with some reflections on how the Ukraine crisis actually exemplifies some of the things I'm talking about. So in terms of hegemony, my quick take on this, there are 6 areas in which I'll compare this. The first one is hegemony. Well, the multipolar world of Europe, the traditional multipolarity was anti-hegemonic. So every time a power tried to rise, whether it's Napoleon or Hitler, other powers ganged up to prevent the rise of that power, often leading to war. So there was always a possibility of one of the great powers seeking hegemony. The liberal international order was not anti-hegemonic, it was hegemonic. It was basically accepted US hegemony, at least in economic terms. The Soviet Union, of course, had material power, military power, but it was not really a comprehensive power. So we had bipolarity in distribution of power, but we have hegemony in overall global architecture, order architecture. What about multiplexity? In a multiplex world, it's not anti-hegemony or hegemony, it's what I call post-hegemony, because the conditions in the world are such that no country can achieve global hegemony. It's not a question of countries trying and failing. It's basically the system is predisposed towards achieving any single hegemony, which is, by the way, true of historical reality. Hegemony, global hegemony is not easy. And here I agree with Joe Mearsheimer, very rare agreement, that it's much easier to achieve regional hegemony than global hegemony. There are only 2 powers in the history of our world that have ever come close to achieving global hegemony. Britain in the late 19th century and the United States since World War II. Everybody else was a regional hegemon or empire. So Mongol Empire came very close, but again, it was basically a Eurasian empire. The British Empire did have that kind of hegemony, but everybody else, the Ming Dynasty, the Roman Empire, they were basically regional hegemons. So it's conditions today are post-hegemonic, not really trying to prevent hegemony through war. So I think post-hegemony, without a world without a hegemon, explains the current world order or the emerging world order much better than anti-hegemony, and certainly not hegemony. Second, consequential actors. Many of you in this school do global governance, and you know this, that global governance is no longer the monopoly of states or intergovernmental organizations. All kinds of organizations come in. So who are the consequential actors today? In the multipolar world, the great powers. In the liberal order, the United States, really. And in the multiplex world, states, great powers, regional powers, non-state actors, good and bad, including terrorist organizations, transnational criminal groups, as well as good NGOs, good non-state actors. Even people empowered by social media make hell of a difference today to foreign policy than they ever did before the advent of social media, like Facebook or Twitter, or even smartphones. So we therefore think of consequential actors differently than what we did at the height of liberal hegemony or multipolarity of Europe. What about leadership? Well, that's very easy to explain. The European multipolarity only had Western great powers. The United States joined in reluctantly later, but the 19th century was all European powers. Turkey at some point, but Turkey was also called the sick man of Europe. And Japan, as I said earlier, never given a seat at the table. Japan did everything possible, major reforms, even intervening in China alongside the United States and European powers to get that status. But lo and behold, when Japan went to Versailles after World War I and demanded racial equality as a clause to be in the League of Nations Charter, Woodrow Wilson said no. British said, well, I think Australians and South Africans convinced Woodrow Wilson, and the American senators from the West Coast did not want Japanese immigration. So they said no racial equality. So Japan never got that status. So it was a Western dominated great power. Today, we talk about great powers, we definitely bring in others. China for sure. India, I guess India should be, because the fifth largest economy now, overtaking Britain. And also Russia. Russia at one point, well, Russia was a member of the Concert of Europe, European power. Then after the end of the Cold War, Russia tried for a while to be part of the West. Now we can debate this, but before Putin, Russia was serious about some kind of arrangement where it will be a partner with the West. And some people in the West also wanted this. That's why George F. Kennan said expanding NATO was the biggest, most fateful error of US foreign policy in the post-Cold War era in 1998. But I'll come back to that if you want me to explain. But the thing is that Russia no longer wants to be part of the West. It's not even part of Europe anymore. Russia is Eurasian. Russian identity discourse wants to be Eurasian. So that's a non-Western power for you. Of course, India is non-Western. China is. Japan always had an identity problem, but I think Japanese have accepted that they're not Western, at least many of them. And of course, if you bring in the regional rising powers like Brazil and South Africa, the fact is that the more consequential actors and leaders are actually not just Western, but non-Western. What about leadership? Sorry, not leadership, interdependence. That's a very important point. That's the fourth difference, a parameter I will compare. Now, interdependence under multipolar world was basically trade-based. So Germany and UK, Britain traded a lot, and France, but did not prevent World War II. But it was mainly trade-based. It was kind of a exchange-based. And interdependence also, in that sense, a bit of a misnomer. It was a regional interdependence. It was interdependence among the big powers and focusing on trade. Well, today, if you look at interdependence, by the way, it's much more broad-based, not just about trade. A lot of interdependence today is financial, and also what we call transnational production networks, which really did not exist very much earlier. Now, what about liberal order, liberal hegemony under US? There was interdependence. In fact, it was founded on interdependence. So those of you who know IR theory would know complex interdependence of Robert Cohen and Jonai, 1977 book. But if you look at that book carefully, the first edition, it was all about interdependence among Western countries, among the liberal countries. There's a chapter on Australia and I guess Japan, Canada, but it was basically among the liberal capitalist economies. Later on, the book added some chapters on global interdependence. But people like Bob Cohen, to his credit, said that his idea of neoliberal institutionalism is very Americanocentric. He doesn't really know enough about the rest of the world. He actually says that in the preface to one of his books. So it was basically North-North interdependence. There was very little on other types of interdependence, regional interdependence, North-South interdependence, more importantly, South-South interdependence. And that's changing. So today, by 2014, South-South trade actually almost equals North-North trade. If you look at the pattern, North-North trade is declining relative to South-South trade. And North-South trade also is there, but South-South trade is more area of growth. I mean, it comes and goes depending on pandemic and the other global financial crisis, but the trend is unmistakably to South-South trade, which was not part of the global complex interdependence picture of Cohen and I under liberal hegemony. And that's basically a key feature of the multiplex world. I did say that South-South trade by 2014 was already close to that of North-North trade, but investment also, investment among the southern countries is actually rising in proportion to investment in the Western countries, by one Western country in another. That's still important, but thanks to Chinese investment, Belt and Road, Indian investment in Africa, the South-South investment is a much bigger than it used to be. So therefore, when you talk about interdependence, we cannot go back to either multipolarity, classical sense, or liberal hegemony. And that could even become more pronounced when we have new emerging threats like climate change, pandemics. Now, these are not economic threats, but these are what we call complex transnational challenges, global challenges that really make you feel interdependent, even if you don't act as such. But the fact that a virus from one little town or large town in one country can spread globally to every country in the world, or the fact that climate change affects all of us, creates a sense of interdependence, or even if we don't always act on it. And then finally, the fifth point will be institutions. Fifth parameter will be institutions. Today, we have much more institutional density and diversity than either under multipolarity or under liberal hegemony. Under multipolarity, not much. Concept of Europe, 1815, basically European Great Power Club. Didn't even include countries like Poland. They were excluded and marginalized. During the, well, we had Universal Postal Union, we had until World War I created League of Nations, which failed. Under liberal hegemony, we have many more institutions, but they are also all American, either instigated or dominated. So we still have an IMF whose head is a European. We still have a World Bank whose head is an American. And although this is changing, but these institutions at the height of liberal hegemony were dominated by Western countries. And this is one of the demands of the developing countries. They don't want to get rid of UN or IMF World Bank. They want a reform of these institutions to democratize them, whether you like it or not. That is their demand. So institutional density is higher. We have far many more institutions than before, either under multipolarity or liberal hegemony. We have more variety of institutions, and those institutions, at least the aspiration is to make them more democratic. More institutions will be more democratization of global governance. So China has led the creation of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The BRICS have the BRICS New Development Bank. We also have regional institutions, not just in European Union, but also in Southeast Asia, Africa. So, and covering many issues, not just trade or security, but environment, human rights, and pandemic, global health, or regional health. So this is a very different world from either multipolar world or a liberal hegemonic world. And finally, ideas of modernity. Now, during the multipolar world, the operating rule was standard of civilization. There is a standard of civilization that comes out of the West, Western culture, values, also institutions. The rest of the world doesn't meet it, they're uncivilized. Only Japan was brought into, because Japan into the club of civilized powers after Meiji reform, but that too only in a limited way. India and China, most civilized countries on earth, going by numbers, at least among them, were considered uncivilized. Now, this was not a cultural term. This was a institutional term. It was the foundation of modern international law, but still very racist, openly racist. Now, the United States under liberal hegemony did not have a standard of civilization in the same way, but it inherited a lot of that. Actually, George Washington, the founding president of the United States, wanted to civilize the native Indians, as did Thomas Jefferson. They thought native Indians did not have civilization. The rest of the world also was not seen as equals. A lot of racism went into the making of multilateral institutions, which is a part of the argument I'm making in a new article called Race and Racism in the Founding of the More Modern World Order. It just came out in International Affairs in January. So the United States tried to camouflage that civilization discourse under multilateralism, but not quite get rid of it because it still was beholden to the same norms and institutions. It was, United States was born out of European settlers. So you expect that. What about multiplex world? Well, the term that I prefer to use is multiple modernities. So there's not a single pathway to modernity. This is a term from Samuel Eisenstadt from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. That then there's not a single path to modernity. Means progress, stability, and development. Different countries, different regions have achieved modernity in different ways. And I'll come back to that later since the time is running out. But I would simply say these are the 6 ways in which, 6 parameters in which we can differentiate a multipolar world from a liberal hegemonic world from a multiplex world. Now, what about Ukraine? Okay, Ukraine is new, it's still playing on my head. I think it's too early to make any definitive statements about how this will affect world order. But let me say a couple of points along the parameters I outlined. What about hegemony? Well, Ukraine is not going to lead to anybody's hegemony. In fact, it is kind of going to undermine anybody's hegemony. It is in the United States, those people for the United States might come back to be the global hegemon, the unipolar moment, while the US is now facing a 2-front war. So Russia and in Europe, China in East Asia. So not much, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US is going to be seriously challenged, even though Biden administration is putting up a brave face and said, we are going to manage both. But remember, the United States won the Cold War by focusing on one theater, not 2. After the Nixon visit to China in 1972, US only had one big enemy. That was the Soviet Union. That was Europe. Now it has 2. And that's not going to lead to the restoration of American hegemony. It's not going to make Russia a hegemon. Russia is getting bogged down. It's not going to make China a hegemon either, although some people say China might benefit from the Ukraine crisis. But I can explain why I don't think that's going to happen, because China is also very much constrained by revival of NATO is going to affect China. There is American attempt to create sort of a quad. Things are messy at the moment, but I don't think, even before Ukraine, I don't think China was able to create a global hegemony, and I don't think it will really be able to do so. So we are going to live in that post-hegemonic world. In terms of actors, I think it might actually give non-state actors, not institutions, but other non-state actors a little more leeway, with states and powers bogged down in a geopolitical battle. I think we might open up space for non-state actors. In terms of leadership, well, again, we see, nothing much has changed. Ukraine is not going to change anything. We still have non-Western powers like Russia, India, China playing a role, individual regional powers like Brazil and South Africa. In terms of institutions, this is one area where things will be affected. Institutions are going to be weakened quite severely. It's already happening in the United Nations, but also the thing is that you have institutions and alliances. Alliances are going to be strengthened. So that's why NATO proponents are very happy now, if NATO is strengthened, and that is basically has been a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways. But the thing is, NATO is not a multilateral institution. I beg to differ from those who think NATO is a multilateral institution in the same way as UN. NATO is an alliance. Alliances are always against somebody. Multilateral institutions are inclusive. They don't make judgments. You are not guilty until you are proven guilty. So present past NATO as liberal internationalists have done for the last 20, 30 years. NATO is multilateral and a community. Yeah, it's community and multilateral for Europeans and the United States and Canada, but it's not for the rest of the world. It's not for India, not for China, not for the rest of the world. So alliances will be strengthened, collective defense will be strengthened relative to collective security, at least in the security arena. In terms of one final comment, you can look at the reaction of the emerging powers. Of course, it's still new, but the fact that India and China abstained in the UN Security Council vote for their own reasons. Brazil doesn't want to condemn Russia. South Africa is sitting on the fence. The foreign minister says Russia should withdraw. The president says look for a peaceful solution. It seems like the BRICS are not in agreement with the West when it comes to Ukraine. So we can pass into it. We can read nuances. China has real discomfort. The non-intervention principle that it upholds, or rhetorically at least, is broken. There may be private communications, but the fact is that the BRICS have not identified with the West. And that tells you that there is this challenge, the BRICS challenge to the current world order remains. All right, I'm going to stop here, and I hope we have 15 minutes of Q&A, and I would like to take your questions if there's any.
Amitav, thank you so much for that excellent thought-provoking presentation. I will offer some summary points at the end when I thank you properly, but without further ado, I'd like to turn to the questions, some of which are coming in the Q&A panel, some of which have come to me via other means. So I want to take the first two questions together, those of Andrew Thompson's and Hugh Siegel's. Both wonder if it is your view that in order for the countries of the Western world to engage constructively with the multiplex world, do we need to dilute our views about democracy, gender equity, rule of law, the presumption of innocence, human rights, which are not universally embraced by many of the non-Western powers cited by you this morning? Over to you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think there will be always a disjuncture in values, but it's not going to be a black and white. A West is for human rights, the non-West is for, something else. So for example, those countries in Eastern Europe that aspire to be part of the West and join NATO, like Hungary, for example, are not, or Poland, are not, respecting human rights and democracy in the same way as the other European Union members. So this is the complexity that we're talking about. In other parts of the world, like Asia, there are some countries which have greater respect for human rights. Indonesia, in the current situation, post-Suharto, and tragically, Myanmar, that was opening up, that now is back under military rule. India is going through a period where human rights and democracy is under serious attack compared to, say, the previous government, but that might change. So I would like to, when it comes to this, I actually don't particularly like West versus the rest. Multiplex is a way to cut through. But things like Ukraine, how much rhetoric a discourse in the West is about the West versus Russia. In fact, people always accuse me, who uses the term non-West, as essentializing a term and creating an artificial divide. I asked them to read the Financial Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and say how many times these media uses the term West. So it's okay to use West. It's not so okay to use non-West. In fact, both terms are increasingly meaningless because of the complexity, the cross-cutting nature of values that we have today. So we have in the so-called West countries that are not respecting human rights and democracy, especially the new members of the West. There's no guarantee that Ukraine joining NATO and the European Union will not be like Poland and Hungary. Similarly, there's no guarantee that India and maybe not China, but other non-Western countries, so-called global South countries, will not embrace human rights and democracy. There are many such countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia. So let's just keep that in mind. Multiplex is complex. It doesn't permit straightforward categories like West versus the rest, even though we sometimes have to use this term because it's in terms of convenience, simplification, and because the Western media and the Western leaders use it far more than non-Western countries do, or global South countries do. But good question.
Thank you so much. Somebody else has picked up on your citing of George Kennan's claim, which is bouncing around social media at the moment, that the expansion of NATO into Central Europe is, quote, the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Could you comment or elaborate on this claim?
You know, this is the most ironic thing I have to do in an academic career. I am in agreement with the realists. Not only Kennan, but Henry Kissinger. Read his 2014 article in New York Times, where he said Ukraine should not be a member of NATO. He said, for Russia, Ukraine is not just another country. Now, I am not justifying Putin. I condemn Putin's action in Ukraine, but I also think people who think NATO expansion was had nothing to do with what happened in Europe. I also think they are being blindsided and one-sided. George F. Kennan basically knew that Russia is it's an insecure, paranoid country. I've written about that also in my book. And you bring in an alliance, which was created against Russia in the first place, Soviet Union. So for whatever logic, and it's not just NATO, by the way. The 2014 crisis was actually because of the European Union. And Kissinger actually criticized the European Union, almost condemning it for trying to change Ukraine. Now, these are realists who think that, you should not be carried away by this liberal internationalist rhetoric and change everybody. Now, Putin exploited that. So it's not the cause of his action, but it certainly helped him to find a rationale. That's my position. But to say that NATO has always been inclusive, multilateral, good intentions, NATO should have been abolished a long time ago. Or at least we turn into a OSCE should have been, which Canada invested a lot in, should have been expanded. I don't want to see who killed OSCE. Both sides have to be blamed. But my point is that these are realists who have actually talked about this, and I side with them. By the way, not just realists. Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt both rejected the European-style alliances. Profound distrust. One of the points, Wilson's points, Putin points, Franklin Roosevelt told Winston Churchill, we don't want to reproduce Europe's regional architecture to have a universal collective security. So it's not just realists, but also liberal internationalists, the foundational people. They rejected alliances. Now, alliances do have a purpose when there is a direct threat, but you don't want to invent the threat. You want to turn them into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Many people will disagree with that. When I write that, I get people jump at me. I said, oh, no. NATO expansion had nothing to do with it. I said, you are just as wrong as those who say it was only because of NATO expansion that Putin acted the way. Putin acted because of regime security, some sort of sense of reviving, making Russia great again. But certainly NATO expansion has also been mishandled. It could have been handled much better. There have been, Austria, Switzerland models, which you could have applied to. Even Kissinger talked about Finland. If the idea is to keep peace, we don't have to be ideologically blindsided about, reviving an alliance. And now talking about what is the consequence, by the way? As the title of my article in Barham said, Europe has just become the world's most dangerous place. We used to think of Asia 5 years ago or 5 days ago. Has NATO expansion really made Europe secure? The jury is out, we'll see, but certainly doesn't look at the moment like that.
Thank you very much. And on related to the current situation in Europe and Russia and Ukraine, Derek Hall points out that things have moved very swiftly over the last couple of days and that Russia's economy in foreign exchange terms is already 2/3 the size it was on Sunday. Might the Russian invasion not lead to a huge upsurge in cooperation and shared purpose among US allies and close partners on all sorts of issues, including renewable energy, action to wean Europe off of Russian fossil fuels?
Absolutely. And that's happening in the short term, and Americans are hyping it. I just heard a couple of people in the National Security Council yesterday on a small webinar saying all kinds of cooperation is breaking out. But ultimately, the major European powers, Germany and France, will see differently. Their interest will be a little different from the interest of the United States. And also, which United States are you talking about? I mean, is United States a trustworthy country? When Trump's foreign policy, he could be the once and future president. And it's so much different. He celebrates Putin. So just imagine if Trump was in the White House. We don't have anything like that, what is happening in terms of US mobilization of allied opinion. Trump distrusted NATO. Trump ridiculed Germany, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, ridiculed Emmanuel Macron, Australian Prime Minister. So what if Trump comes back in 3 years? So because of this profound division in American body politic, it's pretty hard to say how far this unity will go. In the short term, it will produce effects. It might really cripple Russian economy. But remember, Russia is a country very used to long hardship. And of course, it's going to be very painful. You have to feel really sorry, not only for people in Ukraine, but also for Russians. I just tweeted that Putin's invasion has robbed 2 countries of their future, Ukraine and Russia. And it is going to be really painful. But if some changes happen in the long term, I don't see how the Europeans will continue these sanctions into indefinite future. But that's my view, and I am looking at it from a non-NATO, non-US perspective.
Thank you very much. There are a number of questions that cite different actors. So your comments on a number of those, such as ASEAN, small countries, and non-state actors. And the question on non-state actors is really asking, you've mentioned them a few times, what actual non-state actors do you think are on the rise in terms of influence?
Yeah. Well, there are good non-state actors and bad non-state actors. So the bad non-state actors like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda declining now, but they will come up, something else will come up. They, of course, create disorder, and sometimes they create disorder on a global scale. Until 5-6 years ago, before China and Russia became, again, America's #1 enemy, the Pentagon, in its reports, regularly painted Al-Qaeda and Islamic State as America's public enemy #1. Most significant threat facing the United States was terrorism, not Russia or China. That's like 5-6 years ago. You can go back and look at it. So they are very important. Transnational criminal groups are important. Now, those who money laundering, people smuggling, drug trafficking, the majority of people violence in, say, Central America happens because of these type of actors, not because of invasions or revolutions. So they're bad non-state. Good non-state actors, again, I think the best way to look at it is when non-state actors act in partnership rather than individually. There is no non-state actor that can really govern the world, either singly or just among cooperation among non-state actors. They work best when they partner the UN, partner national governments, partner regional organizations, partner even municipal governments. A lot of climate change mitigation and action is now between municipal governments and state governments, provincial governments, and non-state actors. So this hybridity, what you call complex governance, part of the multiplex world, what I call G+ governance. This is a term that I've been using. G+ is not G1 or G2 or G7 or G20 or G77 or G0. It is G+ because it means 2 things. One is that non-state actors do get into global governance, not the monopoly of big multilaterals like UN or IMF, World Bank. It is G+, plus being non-state actors. But also there's another thing that is related to that no country, no power leads in every issue area. So for example, I would say that European Union is a leader on climate change. It leads in that area. China, again, whether you like it or not, spends more money on international development than most countries, and Belt and Road, and it is kind of in that sense leading development, international development as opposed to trade. The United States can lead when it comes to genuine collective security, like Iraq 1990-91. I was at the Oxford Union debate last October, my only trip until now in the pandemic, and we had this question, about whether the world needs American leadership. You can watch the video. I said, no, not exclusively. The kind of rhetoric Obama used to say, if America doesn't lead, nobody else will. Or Madeleine Albright, America is the indispensable nation. Nobody is an indispensable nation now. It's everyone's world. There's a lot more opportunity, but that opportunity comes best through hybridity rather than exclusive leadership by either states or non-state actors.
Thank you so much. Amitav, could you comment on sanctions in about 30 seconds? There's a lot of talk about sanctions. Are there other contingencies that should be being explored at the moment? Sanctions are debilitating. They're not a passing fad. Your quick comment on that, please.
I think sanctions, the history is very clear. The record, they work only in some cases in the immediate context, but in the long term, they don't. I think the best way to do to manage Ukraine now is to go back to table, negotiate, talk. And it cannot be directly, can be indirectly through a third-party mediation. The UN Secretary General, preventive diplomacy, maybe Canada. I think you need Modi has already offered to do that. You need to really sit down. You know, a bunch of powers are putting the whole world into hostage, including Russia, but also some NATO countries. When vast majority of Americans have lost 1 million lives, the world is in the middle of a deep pandemic. So we need to get away from this, talk this genuinely, and try to focus on things that are actually killing millions of people.
Amitav, on behalf of the whole Balsillie School of International Affairs community, thank you so much for an informative, insightful presentation. Your arguments were so compelling. You helped demystify the term multipolarity. You helped set out a very convincing framework underpinning your rejection of the term multipolarity and your embracing of the term multiplex, and defended this based on 5 broad arguments. These arguments align with many of the critical challenges to humanity that the Balsillie School is deeply concerned about and which collectively represents our mandate. We hope you will return again one day soon. The comments coming in from the audience really indicate how much everybody enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Take care and stay safe.
My great pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Balsillie School, and the audience. You had great questions. I really enjoyed very thought-provoking, challenging, and meaningful questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll see you on the other end. Goodbye. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.